When my son died, everyone told me grief would come in waves. They were right about the waves. They were wrong about what was underneath them. 3 days after his memorial service, his colleague called me. His voice was careful, measured, the way doctors speak when they're delivering news they wish they didn't have to deliver. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I need you to hear something. Daniel didn't do this to himself. And from what I've seen in the last few weeks, I don't think you're safe, either." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and the grief that had been drowning me suddenly froze solid, cold, still, focused. That was the beginning. Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you about my son. Daniel was 39 years old, a hospitalist physician at St. Luke's Medical Center in Denver, Colorado. He ran 5 days a week, coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings, and called me every Sunday at 11, without fail, for the past 12 years. Even after he married, even during residency, when he was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and vending machine sandwiches, Sunday at 11 o'clock, like clockwork. He was the kind of man who kept his promises. My daughter-in-law came into his life 6 years ago. She was charming in the way certain people are charming, completely, effortlessly, like it cost her nothing because it cost her nothing. She had a way of making you feel chosen when she focused her attention on you. I noticed early on that the charm had an off switch. I saw her flip it once at a family dinner when she thought I wasn't watching. One moment laughing, the next, her face going completely blank the second she turned away from Daniel. I filed that away and told myself I was being an overprotective father. 32 years as a chemical engineer teaches you to trust your instruments. I should have trusted that one. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning in October. The official cause of death was acute cardiac arrhythmia, secondary to medication toxicity. He had a known heart condition, a mild arrhythmia diagnosed 4 years earlier, well managed, practically invisible to his daily life. He took a daily medication for it. He had for years. The medical examiner determined his blood levels of that medication were dangerously elevated. The working assumption was accidental double dosing. A tragic, but not unheard of error. His own prescription, his own hand. Case closed. I didn't believe it then. I just didn't have a reason sharp enough to say why. The memorial service was on a Saturday. My daughter-in-law wore gray, cried beautifully, accepted condolences with the dignity of someone who had rehearsed. Friends, colleagues, neighbors filled every pew of the church Daniel had attended since childhood. I sat in the front row and watched her work the room afterward. And something in me recognized what I was seeing without being able to name it yet. Performance. Careful, practiced, flawless performance. That was when I noticed the man near the back of the reception hall. He was standing against the wall with a glass of water he never drank. Watching my daughter-in-law the way you watch someone when you know them differently than the room does. She crossed toward him eventually, angling her path so casually that only someone watching for it would have noticed the intention. They spoke for less than a minute. His hand touched her elbow briefly. She nodded once, something passing between them that wasn't condolence. Then she turned and walked back into the crowd, grief sliding back onto her face like a coat she'd taken off to air out. I started toward the man, but by the time I reached the back wall, he was gone. My son's colleague called me 2 days later. His name was Dr. Elliot Marsh, and he had worked with Daniel for 4 years. He asked me to meet him, not at the hospital, somewhere neutral. His words, a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, not far from the city center. I was there 15 minutes early. He arrived exactly on time, ordered nothing, sat across from me with his hands flat on the table. "I've been going back and forth about this for 2 weeks," he said. "But I can't sleep, and I think if I don't say something, I won't be able to live with myself." He told me that in the 3 months before Daniel died, my son had been visibly unwell at work. Not his heart, his mind. He was distracted. Losing weight, arriving early and staying late, in a way that looked less like dedication and more like avoidance. Elliot had asked him about it once. Daniel had said, carefully, that he was having some personal difficulties at home, that he was trying to figure out the right thing to do. Then he'd changed the subject. The week before he died, Elliot said, he came to me again. He said he had discovered something about his wife that he couldn't explain, and he wasn't sure who he could trust. He said he was going to talk to a lawyer. He asked me if anything happened to him, to make sure his father knew it wasn't an accident. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Daniel's handwriting, neat and precise, the way he wrote everything. A list of dates, account numbers, and one name circled at the bottom, Ray Doyle. I drove home with the paper in my breast pocket, directly over my heart. Upstairs in my study, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. Ray Doyle, Denver, Colorado. It didn't take long. He had a LinkedIn profile, pharmaceutical sales representative, previously a licensed pharmacist, license surrendered voluntarily in 2019. I looked at the photo and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. It was the man from the reception hall. My daughter-in-law called me that evening. She was warm, concerned, wondering if I'd eaten, suggesting I come to dinner that weekend. She was already living in their house, Daniel's house, the one they'd bought together 3 years ago. She mentioned, lightly, that she was thinking of making some changes, simplifying, she said. The mortgage was a lot for one person. I told her that sounded very practical. She said she knew I would understand. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen and began to think like an engineer. An engineer builds a case from evidence, not assumption. He establishes known facts, identifies gaps, develops hypotheses, tests them. He doesn't conclude before he has data, but he also doesn't ignore what the instruments are telling him. The instruments were very loud. I went to Street Luke's the next morning and asked to speak with the hospital's pharmacy director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lund, whom Daniel had mentioned several times with respect. I told her I was Daniel's father and that I had questions about his medication. She was careful, professional, appropriately cautious about patient privacy. But when I showed her Daniel's note, the list of dates and account numbers, her expression shifted. She knew the name, Ray Doyle. He had been a pharmacist at a clinic affiliated with Street Luke's until his license was surrendered. The circumstances were investigated, but never fully resolved. A discrepancy in controlled substance inventory that was attributed to clerical error. He had quietly left and moved into pharmaceutical sales. But Daniel, in the months before his death, had filed an internal inquiry asking whether Doyle still had any access to prescription records. The inquiry had been assigned low priority and was still pending when Daniel died. "Your son thought someone had accessed his patient file," Dr. Lund said quietly. "His own prescription record. He thought someone who knew which medication he took and at what dose might have information they shouldn't have." I drove home in silence, the city moving past my windows like a film I wasn't watching. By the time I reached my street, the grief had finished transforming. It was something colder now, something with edges. I had been an engineer for 32 years. I knew how to work a problem. I started that night. First, I called a private investigator named Frank Delaney, a retired Denver PD detective whom my neighbor had used during a business dispute the previous year. He was 61, direct, no wasted motion. We met at his office on Federal Boulevard, a converted row house with an unremarkable sign. I laid out everything I had, Daniel's note, the reception hall encounter, Ray Doyle's background, the pharmacy inquiry. Frank listened without interrupting, then asked 2 questions. Did I have authorization over Daniel's estate? Yes, I had been named executor. Did I want documentation or action? Both, in that order. He quoted me a retainer. I wrote the check without hesitation. Retirement savings are for security. Truth is security. While Frank began surveillance, I focused on the financial trail. I had authorization as executor to access Daniel and my daughter-in-law's joint accounts and Daniel's individual accounts. What I found over the next 3 days made me sit very still at my desk for a long time. Over the 14 months before Daniel's death, $61,000 had moved out of their joint savings account in transfers ranging from $1,800 to $4,500. Each transfer fell just below the threshold that triggers automatic bank scrutiny. The recipient account was registered to a company called Doyle Consulting LLC. I recognized the name immediately. I hired a forensic accountant named Beverly Marsh, no relation to Elliot, whose office was in the tech center south of downtown. She had 23 years of experience in fraud examination and spoke in the clipped, precise language of someone who had testified in federal court. I gave her everything. 2 days later, she called me back in. "There's more," she said. "Your daughter-in-law had an individual account your son may not have known existed." She walked me through it methodically. The account had been opened 18 months before Daniel's death, funded initially with a $4,000 cash deposit, then fed steadily with transfers from a PayPal account linked to an email address that wasn't my daughter-in-law's personal email. Beverly had traced it to a secondary address registered under a variation of her middle name. In that account was $34,000. But the most important thing Beverly found wasn't money. It was a credit card statement linked to the same secondary email. Among the charges was a purchase from a laboratory supply company. 2 items, a high-precision digital scale accurate to 1/100th of a gram and a quantity of a pharmaceutical compound that Beverly printed and handed to me. Without comment, I recognized it immediately. 32 years in chemical engineering, specializing in pharmaceutical intermediates for the last 16 of them. The compound was a potentiator, a substance that in small quantities, introduced to certain cardiac medications, dramatically amplifies their effect without changing their appearance, taste, or detectable form in a standard tox screen. It was not illegal to purchase. It was not commonly known outside a narrow professional context. Ray Doyle, a former pharmacist, would know exactly what it was. I sat in Beverly's conference room and read the purchase date, 9 weeks before Daniel died. Frank Delaney called me that same evening. He'd been watching my daughter-in-law for 6 days. She was meeting Ray Doyle regularly Tuesdays and Friday afternoons at a townhouse in the Highlands neighborhood registered in a name Frank was still running. They arrived separately and left together. Frank had obtained audio on their 3rd meeting using equipment I didn't ask him to describe in detail. He played me 37 seconds of the recording over the phone. My daughter-in-law's voice, easy, almost bored. "The insurance company is taking longer than I expected. These things move slowly. Ray Doyle, with an edge beneath the surface. I've been patient. I need to know when we're looking at." Her response, perfectly measured. "Spring. Once the estate clears probate and the claim processes, we sell the house. We're done with Denver." "Then, what about his father?" A pause. "He's old, and he's grieving. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him." I set the phone down on my kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Outside, the October wind was moving through the cottonwoods along the street, and the sound of it was very ordinary against what I had just heard. Then I picked the phone back up and called Sandra Mitchell's office. Sandra was an attorney in Denver, specializing in wrongful death litigation. 15 years of it, a track record that made insurance companies anxious when they saw her name on a filing. Her assistant scheduled me for an emergency consultation at 7 o'clock the next morning. Sandra reviewed everything I had in 2.5 hours, drinking black coffee and making notes in a yellow legal pad without looking up. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "You have financial conspiracy, clear and documented. You have surveillance evidence of an ongoing scheme to defraud you of your estate, and you have forensic chemistry that points toward premeditation." She paused. "What you don't have yet is an explicit admission linking them to Daniel's death. The compound purchase is devastating circumstantially, but a defense attorney will argue it was never used, that it was purchased for other purposes, that the elevated medication levels were accidental. What do I need? Them saying it on the record, or evidence of how the compound got into Daniel's system?" She picked up her pen again. "The good news is that they think they've already won. Comfortable people make mistakes." I understood her immediately. I went home and called my daughter-in-law. I told her I'd been thinking about what she'd said, the house, the finances, all of it. I said I was starting to see the sense in it. I said the house held a lot of painful memories. The warmth in her voice was immediate and total. She said she knew this was hard, that she was proud of me for being practical, that she wanted to help me through the process. She said she'd already spoken to a real estate agent just to get a sense of the market. Nothing formal, just preliminary. She said the house was worth a great deal and divided properly. It would give us both a very comfortable foundation. She said she could bring the paperwork by this weekend. I said that sounded fine. Every word was recorded by the device Frank Delaney had lent me, the size of a shirt button clipped inside my collar. Sandra had coached me for 40 minutes on exactly how to move the conversation. The call lasted 11 minutes. My daughter-in-law said more than she intended. She mentioned, without seeming to mean to, that the insurance company would likely process the claim within 60 days. She mentioned that she'd already identified a real estate attorney to handle the property transfer. She mentioned, when I said I wasn't sure I understood estate law, that she had someone she trusted helping her navigate it, someone with a financial background who was very good with these things. I asked who. She caught herself. "An old family friend," she said. "Nobody I'd know." After I uploaded the recording to my secure cloud storage, I sat at the kitchen table and added it to the case file that was now too thick for a single folder. I had motive established across 14 months of financial fraud. I had opportunity, Ray Doyle's access to pharmaceutical knowledge, and the documented compound purchase. I had behavior consistent with consciousness of guilt. I had 2 people actively planning to strip my son's estate and potentially target me next. I needed the mechanism. I needed proof of how the compound entered Daniel's system. Beverly Marsh had given me a thread. She'd found the laboratory supply purchase through the secondary credit card, but the delivery address for that order wasn't my daughter-in-law's home address. It was a UPS store box in Lakewood, a suburb to the west. Frank checked the store. The box was registered under Ray Doyle's name, but Beverly found something else during a second pass through the records. 3 weeks before Daniel died, there was a charge to the same secondary credit card at a pharmacy in Aurora. A small pharmacy, not a chain. The kind where the pharmacist knows the customers. Frank drove out there with a photo of my daughter-in-law. The pharmacist recognized her immediately. She had come in asking about interactions between cardiac medications and over-the-counter supplements. She had been very thorough very detailed about specific dosages. The pharmacist remembered because the questions were unusually specific for someone who said she was asking for a friend. Frank recorded the pharmacist's account and filed a written statement. Detective Rita Navarro had been assigned to Daniel's case in a limited capacity. It had been ruled accidental. So, her involvement was administrative rather than investigative. I went to her directly, not to plead, but to deliver. I arrived at Denver PD's District 6 station with Sandra Mitchell and 4 folders organized chronologically. We spent 3 hours in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and stale air. Navarro read everything without speaking, asked 3 clarifying questions, then sat back. "This is circumstantial," she said finally, "but it's the strongest circumstantial case I've seen built by a civilian outside of law enforcement." She looked at me, the compound purchase combined with the pharmacy inquiry and the financial pattern. "That's enough for me to reopen as a suspicious death investigation. I can get a warrant for Doyle's phone records and the email accounts." She stood. "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry your son's case wasn't looked at harder the first time." I told her I understood the constraints. What I cared about was what happened next. What happened next was that Navarro moved quickly and quietly. Within a week, warrants had been executed for Ray Doyle's phone records, his personal email, his financial accounts, and the email associated with Doyle Consulting LLC. Frank kept his surveillance active on both my daughter-in-law and Doyle under a parallel agreement with Navarro's department. At home, I kept performing. My daughter-in-law came for dinner that Thursday. She brought wine, a good bottle, the kind you bring when you're celebrating something the other person doesn't know about yet. She had a folder of documents, real estate market analyses, a preliminary property valuation, a draft agreement for transferring the house to a joint trust pending sale. I looked at it slowly, the way a man who is overwhelmed looks at paperwork. I asked careful questions, confused questions. She answered each one with the patience of someone who is certain they're winning. "I just want to make sure Daniel would approve," I said at one point, letting my voice catch slightly. She covered my hand with hers. "Daniel would want us both taken care of." I nodded and said nothing. The recording device was in my breast pocket. The dinner lasted 2 hours. She left satisfied. After the door closed behind her, I sat in the kitchen for a long moment. Then I got up and washed the wine glasses she had brought and thought about my son calling me every Sunday at 11 o'clock. 8 days after Navarro reopened the investigation, Frank called me at 6:45 inches the morning. "Something's happening." Doyle showed up at her house early, before 7 o'clock. Not a scheduled visit. He's agitated. You need to hear this. He had audio from a device placed near the property. The sound quality was imperfect. Wind noise and distance filtering the voices, but the words came through. Ray Doyle, sharp and frightened. "The police pulled my phone records. My attorney called me this morning. They're not calling it accidental anymore. My daughter-in-law, keep your voice down. Don't say anything to anyone. Our names are not connected to anything concrete. I bought those supplies. I ordered them. Through a box registered to you." "Yes, I know. That's your problem, not mine." His voice rose. "Excuse me?" "My problem. You told me it was untraceable. You told me the levels would read as accidental within normal variance. You're the one who knew what his doctor prescribed. You're the one who—" Her voice cut clean and cold. "Stop talking." A silence. Then Doyle, quieter. "I could lose everything. I need to know you're not going to let me take the fall for this." Her answer came after a long pause. "If you say another word to anyone, I will tell them it was all your idea." I forwarded the audio to Navarro within the hour. She texted back 40 minutes later. Warrant issued. Ray Doyle was brought in for questioning that afternoon. He arrived at the station with a lawyer and the expression of a man who has already been calculating which version of the truth costs him least. Frank heard from his contact inside the department that Doyle stopped the interview twice, consulted his attorney in the hallway, and by the third session was asking about the terms of cooperation. 3 days later, Navarro called me. Doyle accepted a plea agreement. He's going to provide full testimony, everything. She let that settle. He administered the compound. He obtained it through the supply company. He adjusted the quantities under specific guidance, and he's prepared to testify in detail about who provided that guidance and when. My daughter-in-law, I said. It wasn't a question. She planned it. She identified the medication, researched the compound, directed the method. Doyle had the pharmaceutical knowledge to execute it. She had the access to Daniel's daily routine, to his pill organizer, to his morning schedule. She knew exactly when he took his medication and how to ensure the augmented dose was indistinguishable from his usual one. I sat down. Daniel's Sunday morning runs, I said. He always took his medication before his run. He'd been doing it for 4 years. Yes, Navarro said quietly. She knew his routine better than he did. Sandra Mitchell filed the wrongful death lawsuit in Denver District Court on a Thursday morning. 41 pages. Wrongful death. Conspiracy to commit murder. Fraud upon the estate. Conspiracy to defraud the decedent's father. She was seeking $2,800,000 in damages, compensatory, economic, and punitive. The punitive damages alone were substantial enough to absorb every asset my daughter-in-law currently held or expected to receive. Sandra also filed an immediate challenge to the life insurance claim. The policy was $600,000 taken out on Daniel's life 14 months before his death. At my daughter-in-law's insistence, Daniel had increased the benefit amount 8 months before he died. The insurance company's legal team received Sandra's brief on a Friday and suspended payment processing by Monday. My daughter-in-law didn't know the check wasn't coming. Navarro executed the arrest warrant on a Monday morning, earlier than my daughter-in-law would have expected anything. I know because Frank called me as it was happening. 3 vehicles, 4 officers, Navarro in civilian clothes. The formal charge was conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. My daughter-in-law was released on bail 2 days later. $300,000 secured against property. She was fitted with GPS monitoring and prohibited from leaving Colorado. Her attorney filed the standard motions: change of venue, suppression of evidence, and a civil countersuit against me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming I had invented the entire investigation out of grief and paranoia. Sandra had the countersuit dismissed within 10 days. She presented the recordings, the financial evidence, the surveillance documentation, and Doyle's preliminary testimony. The judge sanctioned my daughter-in-law's attorney for filing a demonstrably frivolous claim. Sandra called me afterward. "Round 1, she said. The civil trial began on a Wednesday in April. The courtroom was formal and quiet, gray morning light coming through the high windows. My daughter-in-law sat at the defense table in a dark blue suit, her expression composed. She had spent months practicing it. I recognized the work. Sandra opened with a timeline. 14 months. She walked the jury through it step by step: the financial transfers, the insurance increase, the laboratory supply purchase, the pharmacy visit, the surveillance, the recorded conversations. She put Beverly Marsh on the stand for 2 days. Beverly was precise, calm, and devastating. She walked the jury through $61,000 in transfers and $34,000 in a secret account, and a credit card charge for materials that, according to the expert toxicologist Sandra called next, were consistent with causing exactly the kind of cardiac event that killed my son. The toxicologist was a professor from the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He explained to the jury, without condescension, how the compound interacted with Daniel's medication, how a precise quantity, introduced over several administrations, would cause the blood levels to climb, how it would read on a standard toxicology screen as excess medication rather than an external agent, how someone with pharmaceutical training would know this, how someone with intimate access to the victim's daily routine would know how to deliver it. There was silence in the courtroom when he finished. My daughter-in-law's attorney fought hard. He argued the financial transfers were personal loans. He argued the compound purchase was unrelated, coincidental, that there was no direct evidence connecting it to Daniel's system. He argued that Doyle was an unreliable witness, motivated by self-interest, to minimize his own culpability by shifting blame. He was a competent attorney working a losing case, and everyone in the room could feel it. Doyle took the stand on a Thursday. He had lost weight since the fall. His hair was different, shorter. His posture gone inward, in the way of men who are carrying something they cannot put down. He testified for 4 hours. His attorney had negotiated carefully, and Doyle had prepared. He described the first conversation with my daughter-in-law about wanting a way out of her marriage that didn't leave her with nothing. He described the research she had done on Daniel's medication, which she had shared with him. He described her asking whether there was a way to affect cardiac medication levels without detection. He described his own research, the compound, the purchase, the delivery to the UPS box. He described the Tuesday morning in late September when he had provided the compound to my daughter-in-law in a small sealed packet in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Cherry Creek. He described knowing the morning after Daniel died that what they had done had worked. When Sandra played the recorded conversation from outside my daughter-in-law's house, Doyle's voice saying, "You told me the levels would read as accidental." Several jurors stopped writing. The jury foreperson leaned forward. I watched them watching the evidence. 12 strangers doing their best to hold the weight of what had happened. My daughter-in-law sat without visible expression through most of it. But when Doyle described providing the compound, when the specific date was read into the record 2 weeks before Daniel died, I saw her jaw tighten. Just once. Just slightly. The attorney put his hand on her arm. Sandra's closing argument was 20 minutes. She asked the jury to look at 14 months of deliberate planning. To look at the compound purchase and the pharmacy inquiry and the financial transfers and the secret account. To look at 2 people who had decided that Daniel's life was worth less than the money they could take from it. She asked the jury to look at the recordings, at a woman who described a grieving father as someone who would sign whatever I put in front of him. She paused. Ralph Crawford deserved justice. She corrected herself immediately. The professional slip. Moving past it. Daniel Hale deserved justice. His father spent 7 months building the case the system couldn't build fast enough. All you have to do now is deliver what that work earned. The jury deliberated for 5.5 hours. I sat in a conference room down the hall with Sandra and a cup of terrible coffee and thought about Sunday mornings. 11 o'clock, the phone ringing. My son's voice. When the bailiff came to find us, I stood up carefully. The way you stand when you're 6'4" and something large is about to happen. The foreperson read the verdict standing. Liable on all counts. The damages were $2. $3,850,000 for loss of companionship. $450,000 for economic damages. $1 million in punitive damages. The courtroom was very quiet when the numbers were read. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs and let the quiet land. My daughter-in-law turned and looked at me for the first time since the trial began. I don't know what she was looking for. Whatever it was, I didn't give it to her. Criminal sentencing was 3 weeks later. The district attorney had offered my daughter-in-law a plea agreement after the civil verdict. The mathematics of courtroom probability are not complicated. She accepted. 28 years, no possibility of parole for 20. Doyle received 18 years under his cooperation agreement, eligible for parole after 14. I attended both sentencings. I sat in the third row and watched the judge read the terms into the record. My daughter-in-law's allocution was brief and carefully worded, the language of lawyers rather than remorse. The judge noted that distinction before imposing sentence. Doyle's statement was longer, quieter, and he cried once, briefly, which seemed genuine, even if it changed nothing. The gavel came down twice. The court officers led them both away. Elliot Marsh was waiting for me in the courthouse lobby. He had testified in the civil trial, Daniel's behavior in his final weeks, the conversation about trusting the right lawyer, the note he'd been asked to pass along. He shook my hand and didn't say anything for a moment. He knew something was wrong, I said. He didn't know how wrong. He thought he had time. Elliot looked at the floor. He was trying to protect you. I drove to the cemetery that afternoon. Daniel's grave was in a quiet section of Fairmount Cemetery. The old trees bare in November, the sky a flat, pale gray that Colorado does beautifully in late fall. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets and said what needed to be said in the privacy of an open field. I told him I had kept my promise, that the people responsible were going to spend a long time understanding what they had taken, that the insurance company had voided the claim and the estate was intact, that the house was still standing and still his in every way that mattered. I told him that Elliot was establishing a fund in his name at St. Luke's for residents in financial hardship during training. Daniel would have approved of that, the practicality of it, the way it kept working after he couldn't. I put my hand on the stone for a moment, the cold of it grounding. Then I walked back to my car. That evening I sat on my back porch with a glass of bourbon I'd been saving for a reason I hadn't defined yet. The city lights were visible to the north, the mountains invisible in the dark, but present the way they always are. I had spent 7 months building a case, not out of anger, though anger was there, but out of the obligation a father has to a son who called every Sunday at 11 o'clock, who kept his promises, who asked Elliot to make sure his father knew the truth if something happened. He trusted me with it. I didn't let it go. The bourbon was good. I drank it slowly and thought about what comes next, which is the harder question. Justice doesn't restore what's gone. It doesn't put the phone in my pocket on a Sunday morning. It doesn't give me the conversations we would have had, the years he would have worked and coached and called and lived. Grief is still grief after sentencing. The waves don't stop. But there is a difference between losing your son to something random and terrible and losing him to something deliberate and letting the deliberateness go unanswered. The difference matters. It mattered to me. It mattered to him, or he wouldn't have asked. I finished the bourbon. The cold came in from the mountains, the way it does in Denver in November, clean and direct. I went inside, washed the glass, and left it on the drying rack the way I always do. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue. That's what it means to keep a promise to someone who can no longer hear you keep it. You do it anyway. You keep going. You carry them in the keeping. If this story moved you, please take a moment to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from tonight. Subscribe to Ember Vengeance so you never miss a story. And for the next one, click the box on your screen now. Thank you for being here.